Come along, children. Now we're going to have a little music.
What is up, guys? Welcome to First Cut. This is our review of One Night in Miami, Regina King's new movie that is currently on Amazon Prime. I'm very excited because I'm joined with Sabrina and RB3 to talk all about it. Alrighty, RB3, you told me you talked about this movie beforehand. You got to see it a little bit earlier than everyone else. What are your thoughts on One Night in Miami?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this movie. I think it's a very well done interpretation of this conversation that was a turning point in a lot of these gentlemen's careers, right? With four great men of entertainment and political and historical history, right? We have Malcolm X, and we have a young Cassius Clay before he became Muhammad Ali, and then we have Sam Cooke and also Jim Brown. I think it's just such an interesting kind of dynamic that they put on. I think this movie could have been easily like boring or, tedious or repetitive, but they found a compelling way to keep the drama moving while also staying entertaining, with like having a little bit of a mixture of comedy and drama in there as well. So I really dug it. I thought it was really good performance piece from across the board.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see something like this, because my first initial reaction is thinking of this film from the 80s, Insignificance, where we have like Marilyn Monroe and Einstein and all of them hanging out in a hotel room talking about the political issues of that time and everything like that. So it's interesting to see a film like this, because I think this stands out 100% on its own. Obviously, it's based off of a play, and I think Regina King did a really great job of putting this her vision onto screen. And I think a lot of this film's success is not only due to the performances, but because of her direction. That's exactly why it doesn't feel boring, that they're kind of in one place, and it's definitely pretty stagnant. It always feels like it's moving and it's telling a really compelling story. It's cool to look into these like historical figures, and obviously we have actors like Kingsley Ben-Adir, Aldous Hodge, Leslie Odom Jr., and Eli Gorey. I think every single performance was so incredible, and one didn't like outweigh the next. But quick shout out to Leslie Odom Jr., because that was amazing.
I was going to say, is that your standout? Because I know you don't want to necessarily pick, but if you had to pick, which one is your standout as far as performances between the four?
I really do think that they all work together so well, and their chemistry was off the charts, and it stays pretty even in that way. But I will have to say Leslie Odom Jr., because it just felt like I was just seeing a reflection of Sam Cooke. Like, just from the way he was moving and his cadence, it was incredible.
How about you, RB3? Who's your standout?
I would probably say Leslie Odom Jr. as well, but also the actor who portrayed Malcolm X. And what was his name again, Sabrina?
Kingsley Ben-Adir.
Kingsley Ben-Adir. Very talented British actor playing Malcolm X. Very interesting casting. That's something we've talked about a lot on First Cut recently. But I thought he absolutely nailed it. And I think all of these people we're familiar with on one level or another cinematically, right? From Malcolm X have already been played by Denzel Washington in that iconic like Spike Lee movie, to Muhammad Ali being played by Will Smith, to Jim Brown, who was literally in movies. Like, we saw him be in movies, so we are familiar with him, and also Sam Cooke, who's a international entertainer. So all of these like so we're kind of familiar with these characters as is, but I felt like Leslie Odom Jr. he both invoked Sam Cooke very well, but he also made it feel naturally like himself too. Like I felt like I was watching Sam Cooke on screen, but I also felt like it didn't feel like some sort of impersonation. I do felt like the one actor or the one character out of the four that felt a little bit impersonate-y, like close to that, was probably the actor who played Cassius Clay. And I don't necessarily say it was a bad performance, but I think his characterization in this movie was to be more of the younger dynamic in the group, like the more charismatic, over the top, like overly energetic, kind of funny, almost comedic relief in this. But I think that's not a deterrence to the movie at all. I just think they did a really good job of having four really strong dynamics between each characters to make the conflict really elevate to a really dope place.
I would agree with that as well, but I feel like a lot of that has to do because of who Cassius was, right? His personality, every time he spoke, he was on camera. Like the cameras were always on him, and everyone knows his cadence. Everyone knows how he looks, how he speaks, his ad libs, all that kind of stuff. So I feel like that might have been a detriment to him as well because you compare him to the Muhammad Ali. To me, I mean, obviously, guys, I love Leslie Odom Jr. and I think he's incredible as Sam Cooke, but I really do feel like something has to be said about Kingsley Ben-Adir. I think he killed it. I really do feel like he nailed the kind of roller coaster emotions of him, the whole like straight and properness of himself, and then still letting his guard down a little bit as well by the end of the film because I thought that was a big moment. But overall, I really love this movie. I think it's so interesting how you can get so much out of a conversation. You could set this movie anywhere, right? You could set this movie in a restaurant. You could set this movie in a car, sitting in a car and talking. You could set this movie in a barber shop, anywhere you can pretty much set this movie. It's just centered around the conversation. So the writing to me is what really had to stand out, and I feel like the writing is what stood out the most. It just really felt like a genuine debate slash discussion about politics, economic policies, art, the construction and the measure of success. What a responsibility of being a black man in the 60s was. What kind of responsibility do you hold by being a man of power in your position or in your field? I think that was so fascinating and so interesting. And I think I always find those to be fascinating. It just happened to be 10 times better because it was Sam Cooke, Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, and Brown, Jim Brown. And that to me is kind of what nailed it because you get to see what they would speak about during this time. And I thought that was so interesting. The debates between Malcolm X and Sam Cooke to me were obviously the highlights of the movie because they butted heads the most. Right. And there were so many times when they would speak and say something and you were like, yeah, and then Sam Cooke would come back and I was like, oh, that's right. That's good. And then Malcolm X would be like, oh yeah, but what about this? And I was like, oh, that's true. Yeah. So the whole time you're just involved with it.
100%. And I love that you mentioned like the writing because the writer is actually also, his name is Kemp Powers, is also one of the writers of Soul. So he definitely, yeah, and he did a really great job obviously on that. So, but Regina King, I think is the standout because of course we see her as this incredible actress, incredible human, but I think she completely like commanded this role that she took on with this film. I think she seriously put her own stamp on this. It's interesting to adapt a play and make it something compelling, like you said. So I think it really, the performances, the writing, and the directing had to be there, and it was.
I definitely felt like the film felt a little play-y. It felt like it was based on a play. You know, obviously it comes from being a play. But I wouldn't say that was necessarily a detriment because I felt very, very entertained by what I was watching, right? And I felt like even though it felt a little stagey, it didn't feel stagey and it didn't feel stagey for the sake of being cheap and inauthentic, where I kind of felt like the Trial of Chicago 7 is a little bit like more over the top with this like kind of court, you know, gestureness, like his movie. It feels more like a movie. This just feels like more of a natural kind of hangout, more of a natural kind of conversation. Actually, there's a couple movies that reminds me of. For one, movie that I kept recommending early on in the pandemic, Get on the Bus by Spike Lee, where it's about a bunch of a bus full of black men driving from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. for the 100-man march. And it's kind of like the same thing of just them discussing different political issues of like the 90s, and especially in Black America. And it also reminds me of that movie that we all talked about, My Dinner with Andre, where it was just those two just talking about like the times. And I really enjoy pieces like that because it, like you said, Andres, it really reflects the dynamics and conversations of you know, at least for me, my grandparents or my great grandparents or, you know, people in my family might have had to encounter and deal with, and what their ideologies might have been, and what that ends up spawning later on down the line. So I just thought it was really incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, that's the thing that I was going to ask you guys, and that'll be like my final question and my final point was this is a play turned into a movie, and at times you do notice that it is a play turned into a movie, not necessarily because of what's going on, but mainly because of the blocking of it, and you start to see like, oh, I could totally see this in a play. Not that that's a bad thing. I just would want to see it in a play as well. But as far as like taking that and turning it into a film, the filmmaking aspect is so difficult to do because there's not a lot you can add to a scene that takes place in a hotel. On a filmmaking level, how'd you feel, Sabrina, about making sure this thing translated on film and not necessarily on stage?
I think they did a really great job with like the movement of the characters as they're having these conversations. It still felt very high energy. I mean, we saw it again this year with Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. That also definitely, it's one of those films where you watch and you're like, yeah, that's definitely a play. But it doesn't take away from the overall tone of the film because we're constantly moving from these different rooms in one building with the characters. And that's the same way in this one. We're moving to different parts of the hotel room. One sitting on a bed grabbing a drink, the other one shouting from like another side of it, and they're going back and forth, and there's just so much movement and energy that I feel like I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I mean, you and I talked about, all of us talked about Marriage Story last year on how certain moments of that felt like a play, and that was something that kind of made it really special to me. So I really like to see that, but with these types of stories.
Yeah, a lot of it is staging, and a lot of it is making sure that the actors know that they're the driving force on screen and not necessarily the visuals or the action or anything else. And I think those are always my favorite movies. And I think that's why that's why One Night in Miami is one of my favorites of 2020. So much there when it comes to the telling of a story, and then it cuts back to the actual story. My favorite moment of that obviously is the Sam Cooke moment where Malcolm X is telling the story of when he performed in Boston, and then the camera kind of cuts away and it shows Sam Cooke in Boston in the story, and then the camera starts to back away and it shows his performance from the front of the stage to the back of the stage. And even though you couldn't hear him, you could feel him in a certain way. And I thought that was such a cool, powerful story. And the way Kingsley Ben-Adir, his Malcolm X character, told that story was just like, that's cool to me. That will always be one of my favorite scenes of last year.
So good.
Yeah, I think that overall. I think what you said, Andres, hit around the head. I think the storytelling of it, even though it is based on a play, the parts that are cinematic are really well done. Like, it's really well shot. It's really well paced. Like, I think the editing is almost like pitch perfect. Like, again, I never felt any kind of bored or any kind of lag with it. And again, for a movie that's just about a conversation, that's very easy to feel like. And for a movie that is very, that could feel stagey and blocky, they chose the right moments to highlight close-ups and whys, and make it to like the parts when they go on the roof and they're having that conversation, and the fireworks. It's like they find beautiful moments in there, and even at the end when they are leaving out together, it's just they it's very heartwarming and heartfelt, and I think it's a great movie. I personally think for future generations to watch and learn something from. So.
Absolutely. Alrighty, guys, that was our review of One Night in Miami. If you've seen this movie, let us know in the comments down below what were your thoughts. We obviously all enjoyed it. Either way, where can everyone find you individually? Sabrina.
You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at SabrinaXMonica, and then also on Twitter at SabrinaOnFilm.
RB3.
And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Director RB3.
And I'm at Squad Leader Race, guys. Make sure you like this video if you liked it. Leave a comment, as I said before. Follow us on social media as well at First Cut TMO. If you want to follow us on Patreon, we have a Patreon as well. Be sure to do that. Either way, for the First Cut crew, we're peacing out. Peace.
Me or you? Take you out the equation. It's either me or you. You do the math, only one can remain.